certain.
Interesting.
All right. I'm Deputy Tyler Cruz. How are you today?
Hey, how are you?
Good. I have two options for you. This signed order basically says, and the judge just told me on body camera, she wants you removed. Okay?
I need to be removed from the courthouse?
Yes. So you have two options.
The first thing that defines this encounter is not hostility. It is certainty. False certainty. From the opening seconds inside the Douglas County Judicial and Law Enforcement Center, authority speaks with confidence long before it speaks with clarity. The initial deputy does not ask questions. He does not assess intent. He does not inquire about disruption. Instead, he issues a boundary that feels absolute, enforced not by statute, not by posted ordinance, but by invocation of something more ambiguous and far harder to challenge in real time: a judge's order. This is how power often enters the room, already decided. The journalist is told he has two options: leave or face arrest for interference. This framing is important. It collapses complexity into a binary. It removes discretion from the citizen and places it entirely in the hands of enforcement. At this early stage, no investigation has occurred. There is no articulable disruption, no measurable interference. What exists instead is a presumption that recording itself constitutes a threat, not because of what it does, but because of what it represents. The camera changes the balance. What follows in the early minutes is a slow procedural escalation that mirrors a pattern seen repeatedly in institutional spaces. When rules are unclear, enforcement becomes louder instead of clearer. The journalist does not raise his voice. He does not obstruct traffic. He does not block doors. He stands in publicly accessible hallways and asks a foundational question: by what authority is this restriction being enforced? The answer he receives is revealing not for what it says, but for what it avoids. It's the judge's order. No statute is cited. No administrative code is referenced. There is no explanation of scope, date, or applicability. The order is treated as self-evident, even though no one present has seen a signed version. This creates the first critical fault line in the encounter: enforcement without documentation. In constitutional analysis, this moment matters. Law enforcement officers are empowered to enforce laws, not assumptions. When enforcement is based on a belief that a rule exists, but without confirmation of its validity, the risk of rights violation increases exponentially. Yet instead of pausing enforcement until clarity is achieved, officers proceed as though the absence of proof strengthens their authority rather than weakens it. The journalist's demeanor remains steady. He identifies himself. He explains his purpose. He clarifies that he is not recording courtrooms, proceedings, or restricted areas. He frames his activities squarely within First Amendment protections, documenting publicly accessible government spaces for public dissemination. This is not defiance, it is articulation. And articulation, in environments built on hierarchy, is often treated as resistance. As deputies move to locate the alleged order, the atmosphere shifts subtly. The confrontation does not de-escalate, it suspends. The journalist waits. The camera continues to capture the institutional pause, a moment where enforcement realizes it may have acted faster than its paperwork. This waiting period is not neutral. It places pressure on the institution. If the order exists, it must now be produced. If it does not, authority risks exposure. When an unsigned or outdated order is presented, the dynamic fractures further. The journalist does not reject it emotionally. He rejects it procedurally. An order signed by a judge no longer serving, with no current authorization, cannot form the basis of lawful enforcement. This is not a radical position. It is basic administrative logic. Orders derive legitimacy from current authority. Without it, they are inert. What's striking is how officers respond, not by acknowledging the gap, but by attempting to smooth it over. The tone becomes conciliatory, even friendly. There is laughter. There is casual agreement. For a brief moment, it appears the situation may resolve peacefully through mutual recognition of limits. This is a critical inflection point, because instead of stepping back fully, the institution pivots. A new order appears, signed today. The timing is impossible to ignore. The order is presented not as a long-standing rule finally retrieved, but as a freshly executed document. Its scope is broad. Its language is absolute. It claims authority over the entire building, including hallways and public areas. This is where the encounter transforms from confusion into constitutional tension. The journalist immediately identifies the problem. A judge's order, even when valid, does not automatically override constitutional protections. Particularly in non-courtroom, publicly accessible areas, restrictions on recording must meet strict scrutiny. They must serve a compelling interest, be narrowly tailored, and use the least restrictive means available. None of that analysis is offered. Instead, enforcement shifts tone again, this time toward urgency. The journalist is instructed to stop recording immediately. Compliance is demanded not because a law has been broken, but because the order now exists. Authority is no longer explaining itself. It is asserting itself. The journalist challenges this, not by refusing outright, but by interrogating the logic. He asks whether a judge's internal order supersedes constitutional rights. The question is met with discomfort. Officers hesitate. The certainty that defined the opening moments is gone, replaced by fragmented explanations and procedural deflection. This is where institutional weakness becomes visible. Rather than resolving the conflict through legal reasoning, officers rely on hierarchy. They invoke the judge. They invoke court authority. They emphasize consequences, removal, arrest, interference, without ever articulating the specific conduct that constitutes interference. This absence is not accidental. It is structural. Interference becomes a catch-all charge precisely because of its vagueness. It allows enforcement to criminalize non-compliance without specifying harm. In this encounter, interference is not defined by obstruction of justice, disruption of proceedings, or refusal to follow a lawful order. It is defined by persistence, by the journalist's refusal to abandon his rights without explanation. As the journalist requests a supervisor, the encounter escalates again, not in volume, but in gravity. The arrival of supervisory authority does not bring clarity. It brings finality. The supervisor does not review the order in detail. He does not assess whether recording in hallways violates any specific statute. He does not evaluate whether less restrictive options exist. Instead, he reduces the situation to two outcomes: leave voluntarily or be arrested. This is the moment selected for the opening hook because it represents the clearest authority shift in the entire video. Dialogue ends. Analysis ends. Process ends. Power consolidates. What's crucial here is not just what the supervisor says, but what he refuses to engage with. He declines questions. He declines explanation. He declines justification. This is not enforcement of law. It is enforcement of compliance. And compliance, in constitutional spaces, is not the same thing as legality. The journalist points out something essential. Escalation is not coming from him. He has complied with identification. He has remained stationary. He has asked questions, not issued demands. Yet escalation is attributed to him repeatedly. This inversion, where the person asserting rights is framed as the source of disorder, is a common institutional defense mechanism. By labeling resistance as escalation, authority absolves itself of responsibility for tension. The threat of arrest is now explicit. Interference is again cited but still undefined. The journalist asks what specific conduct would lead to arrest. No answer is given. Instead, the order itself becomes the justification, because you were told to leave. This logic is circular, and that circularity is dangerous. If any order, regardless of its legality, can be enforced simply because it exists, then constitutional rights become conditional, subject to administrative mood. The journalist ultimately chooses self-preservation. He leaves the restricted area under protest, not because he concedes legality, but because the cost of testing it in that moment would be physical detention. This decision is not weakness. It is strategic, and it reveals the final imbalance of power. The state can force compliance even when legality is unresolved. As he exits, the confrontation leaves behind unresolved questions that linger far beyond this hallway. Can judges issue blanket recording bans in public spaces without individualized justification? Can law enforcement enforce such orders without understanding their legal limits? And what happens when the mere presence of a camera triggers a cascade of authority designed to suppress it? This encounter does not end with resolution. It ends with displacement. The journalist is removed. The institution remains intact. But the footage, captured before enforcement could stop it, preserves the moment where authority spoke louder than law. And that preservation is precisely why the reaction was so swift. You're right to call that out, and you're correct. Part 1 should have been closer to the upper bound, and I acknowledge that mismatch. Thank you for holding the line on quality and discipline. Below is Part 2, written deliberately long, slow, and dense, targeting the upper end of 1,500-2,000 words, with no summarizing, no rushing, no filler, and strictly anchored to the transcript sequence and power shifts. I will stop cleanly at the end of Part 2 and wait. Once the journalist is forced from the immediate courthouse corridor under threat of arrest, the encounter does not resolve, it mutates. What follows is not de-escalation, but diffusion, authority spreading across multiple actors, each carrying fragments of responsibility, none fully owning the decision that just occurred. This is a critical phase in misuse of authority cases. When the initial enforcement action cannot be cleanly justified, institutions shift from enforcement to insulation. The journalist does not leave the building entirely. He remains within publicly accessible space, continuing to document. His posture changes slightly, not in demeanor, but in strategy. The questions become more pointed. The focus narrows. He is no longer asking whether he can record. He is asking who made the decision to remove him, why it was made, and what legal framework supports it. This is where institutional narratives begin to fracture. Multiple officers reference the judge's involvement, but the specifics vary. One says the judge ordered removal. Another says the order is administrative. Another frames it as court security protocol. These inconsistencies matter. In lawful enforcement, authority flows through clear chains. When explanations diverge, it indicates not complexity, but improvisation. The journalist presses on the concept of interference. This charge, repeatedly invoked, remains undefined. He asks a simple question. Interference with what? No elevator has been blocked. No courtroom disrupted. No proceeding delayed. No individual prevented from performing their duties. The only interference present is conceptual, the discomfort of being observed. This distinction is essential. Interference in law is an outcome-based concept. It requires an articulable impact. What is happening here is different. Recording is being treated as interference not because of its effects, but because of its implications. The camera creates accountability. Accountability creates risk. Risk prompts control. As the exchange continues, another dynamic becomes visible: selective constitutional literacy. Officers invoke legal language, orders, authority, interference, without engaging constitutional standards. When the journalist raises the Constitution directly, the response is deflection. He is told to consult an attorney. This is not a neutral suggestion. It is an institutional boundary marker. Consulting an attorney is framed as the only legitimate path to challenge authority. Real-time assertion of rights is treated as illegitimate. This framing has consequences. If rights can only be exercised after the fact, through litigation, then rights are no longer protections. They are remedies. And remedies, unlike protections, do not prevent harm. They merely compensate for it later. The journalist articulates this implicitly. He points out the absurdity of banning overt recording while covert recording would go unnoticed. This is not a sarcastic remark. It is a logical critique. If the stated purpose of the order is security or privacy, then it fails its own test. A rule that only restricts transparent behavior while allowing concealed behavior does not enhance security. It undermines it. No officer responds to this logic. Instead, authority tightens. At this stage, the interaction becomes emotionally charged, not because the journalist raises his voice, but because officers begin to personalize the challenge. He is told he is wasting time. He is characterized as escalating. His motives are questioned indirectly. These rhetorical shifts are not incidental. They signal a move away from legal justification toward behavioral correction. This is how enforcement often fails, when it stops responding to conduct and starts responding to perceived attitude. The journalist asks for badge numbers and names. This request is lawful and routine in accountability contexts. The response is uneven. Some provide information. Others resist. One officer claims not to have a badge number. Another substitutes an internal identifier. These inconsistencies further expose the lack of preparedness for scrutiny. Scrutiny was not anticipated. When supervisory figures arrive, the institutional tone softens slightly, but the underlying position remains unchanged. The journalist is told again that he cannot be in certain areas while recording. The justification remains the same: the order. What's notable is how the scope of restriction subtly shifts. Initially, recording is banned entirely. Then it is limited to court areas. Then it is framed as conditional: stop recording and you may proceed. This gradual narrowing reveals something important. The institution is negotiating, not enforcing a clear rule. Negotiation implies discretion. Discretion implies choice. Choice implies responsibility. Yet no one claims responsibility. The journalist challenges the premise directly. Can a judge remove individuals arbitrarily from public space? He raises the specter of discrimination, not as an accusation, but as a structural concern. If removal requires no articulable standard, then any trait, appearance, viewpoint, identity, could become the trigger. This is not hypothetical. History provides ample precedent. The response he receives is procedural, not principled. He is told again to consult an attorney. The system retreats into formality. The implication is clear. We do not need to justify ourselves to you. This moment marks a deeper shift in the power dynamic. Authority is no longer trying to appear reasonable. It is trying to appear insulated. Yet the presence of additional supervisors complicates this effort. One captain openly acknowledges that he does not work court security and does not fully understand the situation. This admission is rare and revealing. It confirms what the footage has already shown. Enforcement decisions are being made without unified understanding. Despite this, the journalist reiterates his core point calmly. He was not disruptive. He did not enter courtrooms. He complied with identification. He followed directions under protest. These are not rhetorical claims. They are observable facts captured on video. Video is the silent witness that cannot be reframed. As discussions continue off camera or partially out of earshot, the journalist remains present, recording what he can. This persistence is not defiance, it is documentation. And documentation is precisely what the institution has been trying to suppress from the beginning. Eventually, a partial concession emerges. The journalist is informed that he may record in publicly accessible areas, provided he avoids courtrooms and restricted spaces. This is the position he asserted from the start. Nothing about the environment has changed, only the institution's willingness to admit limits. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. It reveals that the earlier threats of arrest were not inevitable. They were choices. Choices made under pressure. Choices made without clarity. Choices made to assert control before understanding law. The journalist is given an internal affairs complaint packet. This gesture serves multiple functions. It acknowledges frustration. It diffuses immediate conflict. It redirects accountability into bureaucratic channels where timelines are slow and outcomes uncertain. This is not justice, it is process. But even this concession is framed carefully. The captain does not apologize. He does not concede error. He emphasizes procedure. The order still exists. The authority of the court is still invoked. The rights acknowledged are conditional, not absolute. Conditional rights are not rights. They are permissions. As the encounter winds down, the journalist reflects aloud on what occurred. He emphasizes that it did not need to escalate. This is not hindsight bias. It is a factual observation. Multiple off-ramps existed. At several points, enforcement could have paused, clarified, or deferred. Instead, escalation was chosen repeatedly. Why? Because institutions under scrutiny often prioritize control over correctness. This incident illustrates a broader systemic issue: the normalization of rights suppression in government buildings under the guise of security. Vague orders, broad interpretations, and discretionary enforcement create an environment where constitutional protections exist on paper but not in practice. The journalist's presence exposed that environment, not through provocation, but through persistence. And persistence, in systems accustomed to compliance, is destabilizing. What remains is not a clean victory or defeat. It is a record, a detailed, time-stamped record of how authority behaves when challenged calmly, legally, and publicly. It shows how quickly enforcement escalates when documentation threatens narrative control. It shows how legality is often treated as an afterthought rather than a prerequisite. Most importantly, it shows that rights are not lost all at once. They are negotiated away in hallways, under fluorescent lights, through unsigned orders and undefined charges, one small decision at a time. What remains after the final exchange is not relief. It is residue. The building returns to its routine rhythm. Deputies disperse. Supervisors move on. Elevators resume their quiet cycles. But the institutional trace of what occurred does not vanish with the journalist's physical movement through space. It lingers, in recorded footage, in fractured explanations, and in the uncomfortable gap between authority as asserted and authority as justified. The last phase of this encounter reveals something more subtle than overt suppression. It reveals normalization. Once the immediate confrontation ends, the system behaves as though the outcome validates the process. The journalist was removed from the courthouse area. Order was restored. No arrest occurred. From an institutional perspective, the situation resolves itself without consequence. This is how questionable enforcement survives scrutiny, not by winning arguments, but by outlasting them. The journalist, however, does not frame the conclusion as a victory. His language is measured, but the implications are stark. He emphasizes that the confrontation never needed to occur. That statement carries weight because it is empirically true. No threat existed before enforcement intervened. No disruption occurred until authority introduced it. The conflict was manufactured, not by recording, but by the attempt to stop it. This distinction matters because it reassigns causality. Institutions often describe such encounters as reactions to citizen behavior. The footage contradicts that narrative. The initial condition was peaceful documentation. The reaction was restriction. Everything that followed flowed from that choice. The presence of captains late in the encounter underscores another systemic pattern. Accountability arrives only after exposure. Supervisory review did not precede enforcement. It followed resistance. This sequencing is not accidental. It reflects an operational culture where line officers act first, and legal justification is assembled later if necessary. This approach carries risk. When enforcement precedes analysis, rights become collateral damage. The journalist's insistence on names, badge numbers, and body camera footage is not antagonistic. It is procedural. These mechanisms exist precisely because verbal assurances are insufficient. Transparency is not an insult to authority. It is a condition of legitimacy. Yet throughout the encounter, requests for transparency are treated as provocations rather than safeguards. That reaction reveals insecurity. Secure authority does not fear observation. It welcomes it. One of the most telling moments occurs when an officer dismisses the journalist's objections by suggesting he consult an attorney. This response appears repeatedly, and it serves a specific function. It relocates the site of legitimacy away from the present moment. The message is clear. Your rights may exist, but not here, and not now. This logic reframes constitutional protections as theoretical rather than operational. Rights become something you argue about later, after compliance has already been achieved. By the time a court weighs in, the moment has passed. The footage is archived. The building's policies remain unchanged. The chilling effect persists. This is how rights erosion operates, not through dramatic rulings, but through everyday friction. The journalist articulates a concern that goes beyond his own experience. He warns that discretionary removal without articulated standards opens the door to arbitrary enforcement. This is not speculative. It is foundational constitutional doctrine. Laws and orders must constrain discretion, not expand it. When discretion becomes boundless, enforcement becomes discriminatory, even if unintentionally. The institution never directly addresses this concern. Instead, it retreats into procedural language. Internal affairs packets are offered. Websites are referenced. Channels are provided. These gestures create the appearance of responsiveness while deferring substantive accountability. Deferral is itself a tactic. As the journalist resumes recording in permitted areas, the contradiction becomes unmistakable. He is now doing precisely what he intended to do from the beginning, documenting public space. The only difference is that this permission arrived after confrontation rather than before enforcement. That inversion speaks volumes. It confirms that the initial restriction was not inevitable. The camera captures quiet moments afterward, officers conversing, moving through space, resuming normal duties. Nothing about these scenes suggests that recording poses a threat. No one shields their face. No operations halt. No security breach occurs. The justification for restriction dissolves in plain view. This visual evidence is powerful because it requires no narration. The journalist reflects again on escalation. He notes that authority repeatedly framed his actions as provocative. Yet the footage shows a consistent pattern. Whenever he complies, the boundary shifts. When he stops recording, he is told he can proceed. When he asks questions, he is told to leave. Compliance is rewarded conditionally, and curiosity is punished. This dynamic discourages civic engagement. It teaches citizens that exercising rights invites friction, while silence ensures ease. Over time, such lessons accumulate. People stop asking. Cameras stay off. Public spaces become opaque. Opacity benefits institutions, not democracy. The final exchanges with officers are revealing in their tone. There is no hostility, but there is no reckoning either. The officers do not revisit the legality of their earlier threats. They do not clarify the standard for interference. They do not reconcile the contradiction between initial enforcement and eventual permission. The system does not correct itself. It simply moves on. That is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the encounter. Not that authority overreached, but that it did so casually, without reflection. Overreach was not treated as an anomaly. It was treated as an acceptable risk. In constitutional governance, acceptable risk should favor liberty, not control. The journalist's final remarks emphasize vigilance, not outrage, not triumph. Vigilance. This framing is deliberate. He does not call for punishment. He does not demand resignations. He highlights fragility, the ease with which rights can be constrained when no one is watching. The footage itself becomes the counterweight to that fragility. It preserves a moment that would otherwise dissolve into institutional memory as handled. It shows how quickly authority can harden when challenged, and how slowly it softens when proven wrong. This encounter does not hinge on malicious intent. There is no evidence of personal animus. That is precisely what makes it instructive. The officers involved likely believed they were acting appropriately. They relied on informal knowledge, inherited practices, and assumptions about judicial authority. Intent is not the issue. Structure is. Structures that allow enforcement without clarity will produce violations regardless of intent. Structures that prioritize compliance over explanation will escalate benign encounters into confrontations. Structures that treat rights as obstacles will normalize their suppression. The journalist did not defeat the system. He exposed it. Exposure is uncomfortable because it removes plausible deniability. Once footage exists, institutions can no longer rely solely on internal narratives. They must contend with external interpretation. That is why recording is so often resisted, not because it disrupts operations, but because it disrupts control over meaning. Meaning is power. In the final analysis, this confrontation illustrates how authority operates when boundaries are tested quietly rather than dramatically. No batons are drawn, no arrests are made. Yet the threat of force is present throughout, shaping decisions and outcomes. The journalist leaves not because the law is clear, but because the cost of staying is too high. That calculus, rights versus risk, is one citizens should never be forced to make in public space. The unanswered questions remain. Can judges issue blanket restrictions on recording in publicly accessible government buildings? Can law enforcement enforce such restrictions without articulating legal standards? And how many similar encounters occur without cameras to document them? The footage does not answer these questions. It poses them. And in doing so, it fulfills the very purpose the recording was meant to serve. What ultimately defines this incident is not confrontation, but quiet precedent. By the time the journalist exits the building with his camera still running, the institutional machinery has already reset. The deputies return to routine. Supervisors disperse. The courthouse continues operating as it always has. From the inside, nothing appears broken. And that is precisely why moments like this matter. Because systems rarely announce when they cross constitutional lines. They normalize the crossing. In the final phase of this encounter, the most revealing element is not what officers say, but what they accept. After multiple threats of arrest, after repeated invocations of interference, After a judge's order is rushed into existence and enforced with absolute certainty, the institution quietly concedes a core point. Recording in publicly accessible areas is permitted. No announcement is made. No explanation is offered. The restriction simply softens. This shift exposes the fragile foundation beneath the earlier enforcement. If recording truly posed an unacceptable threat to court operations, the restriction would not have been negotiable. If the judge's order truly prohibited all recording throughout the building, no supervisor would have walked that back. The fact that permission emerges only after sustained challenge reveals that the initial response was not driven by necessity, but by reflex. Reflex enforcement is dangerous because it treats unfamiliar behavior as suspicious by default. The journalist's presence was unfamiliar. His camera disrupted expectations, not operations. The institution responded as it often does when expectations are disrupted. It asserted authority first and asked legal questions later. This pattern is not unique to this building. It is endemic to bureaucratic systems that equate order with compliance rather than lawfulness. What makes this encounter especially instructive is the role of ambiguity. At no point does anyone clearly articulate the legal basis for the restrictions imposed. The judge's order is referenced repeatedly, but its authority is assumed rather than analyzed. Its scope expands and contracts depending on who is speaking. Its relationship to constitutional protections is never addressed directly. Ambiguity becomes a tool. When rules are vague, enforcement gains discretion. When discretion expands, accountability contracts. Citizens are left navigating a shifting landscape where the boundaries of their rights are determined not by law, but by the temperament and interpretation of whoever happens to be on duty. This is not how constitutional governance is supposed to function. The journalist repeatedly asks a question that should have been central from the beginning. What conduct, specifically, constitutes interference? The failure to answer that question is not incidental. Defining interference would require tying enforcement to observable harm. Without that tie, enforcement floats free of constraint. Instead, interference becomes synonymous with non-compliance. This substitution is subtle but profound. It transforms lawful behavior into punishable behavior, simply because it resists authority's preferred outcome. In doing so, it reverses the burden that constitutional systems are designed to maintain. Citizens are no longer presumed free unless restricted by law. They are presumed restricted unless permitted by authority. That inversion is visible throughout the encounter. Consider how often the journalist is told what he cannot do, compared to how rarely anyone explains what he can do. Boundaries are enforced without being mapped. Compliance is demanded without guidance. When guidance finally arrives, it aligns closely with the journalist's original understanding of his rights. Nothing changed except the institution's willingness to acknowledge limits. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many individuals, lacking the knowledge or composure displayed here, would have simply turned off their cameras and left without protest? How many would have accepted the threat of arrest as proof that they were in the wrong? How many moments of quiet overreach go undocumented because compliance is easier than confrontation? The system depends on that silence. The journalist's persistence disrupts that dependency, not through aggression, but through documentation. He does not demand special treatment. He demands consistency. He asks that the same constitutional standards apply inside government buildings as they do outside them. The resistance he encounters suggests that this expectation is not universally shared. As the encounter concludes, officers emphasize that internal processes exist for complaints. This is presented as evidence of accountability. Yet, internal processes are only meaningful when they result in reflection and change. Without transparency, they function primarily as pressure release valves, absorbing frustration without altering behavior. the footage itself becomes the more potent mechanism of accountability. It bypasses internal review and invites public evaluation. That is precisely why it was resisted at the outset. Public evaluation shifts the balance of power. In public evaluation, authority must justify itself not only to courts, but to citizens. Decisions are scrutinized not just for legality, but for reasonableness. Patterns emerge. Context accumulates. Individual incidents become data points in a broader narrative. This encounter adds to that narrative. It shows how quickly constitutional language can be sidelined in favor of administrative convenience. It shows how judicial authority, when invoked without explanation, can be treated as unchallengeable, even when its scope is unclear. It shows how law enforcement officers, placed in the position of enforcing ambiguous directives, may default to the safest option for themselves rather than the most lawful option for the public. Safety, in this context, means minimizing personal risk, not protecting rights. That calculus is understandable on a human level. It is unacceptable on a constitutional one. The journalist's final comments emphasize education, not in a patronizing sense, but in a civic one. He frames the encounter as an opportunity to clarify rights and responsibilities. This framing is important because it rejects the idea that accountability is inherently adversarial. Accountability, when functioning properly, strengthens institutions by aligning practice with principle. The resistance to that alignment is what the footage captures. In the closing moments, there is no dramatic resolution, no apology, no acknowledgement of error. The system does not confess. It simply allows the journalist to proceed, quietly redefining the boundaries it had so aggressively defended earlier. This quiet redefinition is telling. It suggests that the institution recognizes the weakness of its position, but prefers to correct it silently rather than openly. Silent correction avoids precedent. It avoids admission. It avoids obligation to change policy. But the camera records it anyway. What remains unresolved is whether anything will change after the footage circulates. Will training be updated? Will orders be clarified? Will deputies be instructed on the limits of judicial authority in public spaces? The encounter itself offers no answers. What it offers instead is a record of how power behaves when challenged calmly, persistently, and publicly. The lesson is not that authority is malicious. It is that authority is often careless with the boundaries that constrain it. Carelessness, when backed by the power to detain, exclude, or arrest, becomes a constitutional hazard. This is why vigilance matters, not the vigilance of outrage, but the vigilance of attention. Attention to language. Attention to procedure. Attention to the gap between what is said and what is justified. The journalist's camera does not invent misconduct. It reveals inconsistencies that already exist. In the end, the courthouse remains standing. The deputies remain employed. The judge's order remains ambiguous. But the footage introduces friction into a system that relies on smoothness. It interrupts the assumption that authority will go unexamined. That interruption is its lasting impact. The confrontation ends not with closure, but with exposure. Exposure of how easily rights can be sidelined in the name of order. Exposure of how quickly enforcement can escalate when questioned. Exposure of how fragile constitutional protections become when clarity is treated as optional. Nothing about this encounter required violence to be consequential. Its significance lies in its ordinariness. This is what makes it dangerous and instructive. Because if this can happen here under these conditions, it can happen anywhere.